If you want readers to buy your book, you need to convince them that your book is better than all the other books in your genre that they could buy instead. You need to persuade them that your book is more entertaining than watching their favorite streaming show. And if you want them to recommend your book, they need to actually read it. And ideally, read it to the end so that they want to tell others about it. The stronger your pitch is for your book, the easier it is for readers to recommend it. You may hear your pitch in their mouths if it's good enough. But many authors are afraid to talk about their book. They don't know what to say, or they worry about coming across as a sleazy salesman. Or they don't know how to talk about their book in compelling sentences, rather in long paragraphs, which nobody wants to hear. So, how do you pitch your book so that readers want to buy it? Right? Learning to pitch your book is super easy, barely an inconvenience. All you have to do is keep listening to this episode of Novel Marketing, the longest running book marketing podcast in the world. I'm Thomas Umstattd Jr., CEO of Author Media, and this is the show for writers who want to build their platform, sell more books, and make a difference with writing worth talking about. And we have a guest on the show today to help us through the forest of pitching, a guide who will teach you how to have an excellent pitch. He's a best-selling author, an international award-winning writer-director, and a director of the UK Society for Authors. He's worked with hundreds of authors and screenwriters to help them perfect their pitches. Charles Harris, welcome to the Novel Marketing Podcast.
Hi, Thomas. I have my machete ready to hack through the forest.
So, for many authors, crafting a pitch is some of the hardest writing that they ever do, right? Why is that? Why is writing one paragraph, two paragraphs often harder than an entire chapter of the book?
The answer is quite simple. I mean, you're taking something that may be 30,000 plus words, and you're trying to boil it down. It's bad enough boiling it down to a page, and now you're trying to boil it down to a sentence or two. It is tough, but it is important. I always call pitching the great accelerator. It accelerates all parts of your career. Obviously, it accelerates the ability to sell, not just to readers, but also to publishers and agents, that you need a pitch for that. If you want to sell your book to movies or TV companies, you need to pitch for that. But also, it's really good for helping you develop the idea in the first place. The better your pitch is at the beginning, the better you'll be able to develop the fundamental idea that you're writing. And it's really good for pitching to anyone you want to work with. Cover designers, marketing people, PR. You'll always be using a pitch.
And this is a big mindset shift for a lot of authors, because what you're describing is creating the pitch for the book before writing the book. For a lot of authors, they just go and they write the book, and then they try to create a pitch for the book they've already written. But the advantage of creating the pitch first is that it allows you to get feedback on whether the book is even worth writing, or sometimes tweaks to make the book better. I do a pitch practice from time to time with various conferences. So conferences will invite me to come and speak, and I say, I'm sorry, I have small children, but I'll do an online event for you. And often that online event is a pitch practice for the attendees of the conference. Before the conference will practice their pitches on me, and I'll give them feedback. And almost every time, at least a few authors realize they need to rewrite their book. Because the protagonist isn't active enough. The antagonist doesn't have a clear enough motivation. There's some major structural problem with the book. And in pitching it, they realized that that problem was there. And it would have been a lot faster if they had perfected the pitch first and then written the book to deliver on the promise that the pitch made, that this was going to be a thrilling adventure or a mysterious mystery or a romantic romance or what have you.
Totally. I run workshops in pitching for writers, authors, screenwriters. And I always start off saying, probably 90% of you will go away after doing this workshop when you've developed your pitch, and you will rewrite your manuscript or your screenplay. And that's a lie, because in fact, 100% will. I've never found anyone who doesn't. And I do it myself. I can't write anything if I haven't got the pitch to start with. I need that reassurance that I'm writing something that's going to go somewhere. Having said that, I'll often be rewriting the pitch as I get to know my book better and better.
And that back and forth process, I think, is really healthy.
Yeah.
And I know this is less romantic, right? It's more romantic to go into your cave and emerge with a pristine artifact that is shimmering in the sunlight. But that's not how writing works. And if you want this to be commercial writing, and by that I mean the kind of writing that other people want to buy, right? That has a commercial value, it really has to connect with what other people want. And the pitch forces you to think about the reader a lot sooner in the process. And this is a really valuable element.
Can I just disagree slightly with something you said? Because I think I certainly agree with what you say about developing a pitch first, but not all writers do that. There are pantsers, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. The pitch still comes in, though. The pitch tends to come in at the second draft stage, when you've got all the mess on the paper and you now need to work it out what it is you've got there. And I've done that in the past. One of my most successful screenplays, that was something I just couldn't work out a pitch, couldn't work out anything, just ended up banging it all down. And then I sat back and said, okay, what have I got? Now I need a pitch, because the pitch is my guiding light for doing the edit. So it can come in at that level too. And there's a lot of myths about pitching. The most important thing to be aware of is we build this big mountain in our heads out of what is actually a molehill. They're not easy to do, but they're not as difficult as some people think. You don't have to create this wonderful piece of language or some perfectly polished sort of 3-word sentence that somehow encapsulates everything. It's conversational. And I think that's the most important thing to know about pitching before we even get into the details of things like genre, is it's fundamentally having a conversation. That's what a pitch comes from. A pitch comes from your reader is hopefully going to, like you said, talk to other readers, and they're going to say, what's that book you were reading you said you thought was so good? They are not probably going to produce this little pearl of wisdom in 3 words, and they're probably not going to spend 90 minutes describing the book either.
And if you have ever talked about books with a fellow fan of books, you have pitched a book, right? Have you ever finished reading a book and you're like, man, that was amazing. And you're talking to a friend, and you're like, you got to read this book, and then you gave a pitch for the book. That's what a pitch is trying to recreate. When you're saying a conversational tone, that's the conversational tone, right? It's one friend recommending another friend a book, and here is the one reason why I like the book and why you'll read it. I was recommending Puss in Boots, and it's like, it's got one of the best villains I've seen on screen ever. And I know you think, oh, it's a sequel of a spinoff. The movie can't be good, but the villain is fantastic. So you got to watch it because the villain is worth watching the movie. And that's how I described it. And if I were putting together the pitch for the film, I would have really been like, hey, this villain is worth making a movie about. It's worth a screenplay exploring this topic.
That's a great way to pitch. There's 100 different ways of pitching. I teach a basic template that people can fall back on, and it'll always work. And sometimes you can think of something better, and sometimes you need to adjust things. But you've just given the first word of the pitch, it. In fact, the first 3 words, I always say, it's a. Because if you've begun to answer the question that you asked about genre, I always put the genre at the beginning. And why do I do that? Because we need to be thinking about what's the listener need. All listeners basically need 5 things out of a pitch. For convenience, when I'm doing a workshop, I do my A, B, C, D, E. And particularly when you're pitching to a professional, if you're pitching to an agent or publisher, they will definitely be listening for these. And the A is it appropriate for me? Which is basically genre. Is this the right thing for me? Why would I be interested in this? What emotion is it going to create? Do I feel like laughing or crying? Do I feel like love or danger?
And this also earns you the attention to get to the other letters,
yes.
Right? Because if you say it's a romance, and I'm not in the mood for a romance, I'm out, right? Which is actually beneficial for both of us, right? But if it's a dragon movie, I'm like, go on. Okay, I'm listening.
And the corollary is, if you're pitching professionally to an agent, to a publisher, to a film producer, you'll have done your research. You should have done your research. Is this the kind of thing they do? That isn't always totally accurate. They may have always done rom-coms, but now they want to move into thrillers. But that's why you get online. And if you have a pitch meeting, I always say, don't go straight in with your pitch. Ask them what they're doing. Ask them what they're interested in.
When you're pitching in a professional context like that, so you're with an editor or an agent or a film person, you're not just pitching the book, you're also pitching a relationship with you, right? Because they're going to be working with you. They're going to have to interact with you on an ongoing basis. And so that personal connection is much more valuable. And this is one way where pitching a professional is different than pitching a reader, because the reader isn't going to have a relationship with you in that same way. Maybe you're interacting with them online, but the reader is far more interested in, is this a book I want to buy? Whereas the professional is asking the question, is this a book I want to contract? And is this a person I want to spend time with on an ongoing basis?
Yeah. And the same 5 issues will be in a query letter. When you're emailing an agent or publisher or producer, you want to cover those. But actually, in a funny sort of way, it applies to readers too. B is, it's a horrible word I use, budgetable. Now, in the film terms, it means basically, can I make this movie for the budget that I'm likely to be able to raise by selling it? So you don't think, how much should I make this movie for? You think, how much should I sell this movie for? Who's going to come and watch it? Is it going to be in the big cinemas, or is it going to be on 3 o'clock in the morning on some very obscure cable channel? And that's obviously going to affect your budget, but also affects the kind of thing you want to make, because it's going to be appropriate.
And I would say this applies to books as well, because if you're a super famous person, let's say you're the Prince of England and you want to write a memoir, I can spend any amount of money on getting you ghostwriters, getting you editors, surrounding you with people who'll do all the work to write your book. And I know I'll make the money back in sales, right? But if no one knows who you are, you have to convince the editor that the manuscript is good enough where I don't have to put so much money into it that I can get the money back. And every book proposal is effectively a business plan. And they have to make a business case at the traditional publisher, whether it's worth funding, because it does cost money to publish a book. Doesn't apply as much, I'd say, to indie, but it definitely applies to traditionally published books.
It certainly applies to readers too, because readers are thinking, do I want to invest my time in this book? I mean, is the price of the book, but also the length of the book. Some people only want short books. I've got a friend who only read really big books, and she's not interested in anything shorter. But then the story you're pitching, somehow in that sentence, you have to convince the person, the listener, that the story is right for the length you are going to be doing. It feels like a sort of book they're going to be interested in.
I'm going to live the rest of my life and die and never get back the 10 hours I spent reading your book. So it's got to be worth dying 10 hours to read your book.
C is the word cinematic, because I haven't really come up with a better word, but it's basically craft. But craft doesn't kind of sound quite so exciting. But it's essentially everything that goes into how to write a book. Do I start getting pictures in my mind? Because I think a good pitch should create images. When I'm listening to it, I think, oh yeah, I can imagine that happening. D is for different, and that is important. Although A, interestingly enough, is very much about how similar this is to other books. At the same time, it needs to be somewhat different. If it's not different, then it's not going to stand out.
In business, we'd call this a tension to manage rather than a problem to solve. It has to be different enough to be worth watching.
Yeah.
Because if it's exactly like something I've already read, and I'll just read that thing again. But if it's so different that it's suddenly in a different genre, or if it's not really what I'm looking for, I'm not interested in it. And this is, I feel, for a lot of beginning authors, really difficult to navigate, because they haven't read enough books in their genre to really know where they fit. They've read the most famous books, right? They're writing an epic fantasy, and they've read Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, but they haven't read the B tier, the stuff that kind of true fantasy readers have read, right? Because you don't have to be a fantasy reader to enjoy Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, right? Those are popular stories in the general market. And as you read more, especially what's coming out in the last year, right? What are people buying right now? You get a sense of how is this different and how is this appropriate? And this is a real test of your fluency in your genre. And when I'm saying genre, I'm meaning your like sub-genre, right? We're talking 3 or 4 levels down on Amazon, right? This isn't romance. This is not historical romance. This is specifically Edwardian England historical romance, right? Like, how do you compare with the other Edwardian romances that have come out in the last year? And if you haven't read any of those, then how will you even know if it's appropriate and different, right? You're going through the fog. Charles can chop down the trees, but you got to have a lantern to see through. And we can't provide that for you because we don't know your specific genre. You have to provide that for yourself by reading your specific genre and becoming very, very fluent in what readers are expecting.
Good authors read enormously. And it's also Broca. You've got a great episode on that, haven't you? It's sparking that part of the brain that reacts to difference, to something a bit special and interesting. And without that, your pitch is probably going to fall flat. For people who haven't heard that episode, I do recommend that very highly.
And we'll have a link to it in the show notes about how to shock the Broca region of the brain. If you have no idea what that is, then you're in for a treat. The James L. Rubart has a great explanation of that.
I loved that one. E is for employable, which kind of is again, I was trying to squeeze this into A, B, C, D, E, but it basically means, why should I be interested in this writer? What is it about you that makes you the absolute perfect person to be writing this?
And often when pitching an agent or an editor, one of the ways they get to the answer of this is they'll often ask, what else do you have? Yeah. What other ideas do you have? Because they're thinking, oh, if I'm going to sign a contract for this and it blows up, we're going to want to do another book. Do you have other ideas that are related to this, right? If your first romance is really popular, we want to know that you have the ability to write another romance. You have other ideas that you're excited about. And sometimes when they hear your other ideas, they're like, wait, stop. That fourth one, give me a proposal on that one.
Yeah.
I can get that through Pubboard in a week. I've been looking for a story just like that. And knowing that you're not just a one-trick pony, that you don't just have this one story instead, your only hope, really makes you more attractive, not just to editors and agents, but also to readers, right? If readers like your first book, they want to read more books from you.
We should possibly do a few definitions, by the way, because people use pitch in different ways. We're using pitch basically to mean one sentence because of that sort of word of mouth, standing by the water cooler thing. Some people talk about pitching as being a longer thing. You have a pitch meeting where you go into much more detail. But essentially, it is still the one sentence. That's the core of it. It's sometimes called a log line. And I do recommend, going back to talking about the employable, the E, you should have your personal log line, your personal pitch. In other words, you get that horrible question, what do you do? Who are you? Have something you say what you do. I might say, depending on circumstances, I am an award-winning writer-director now writing novels. Or I might say, I am a novelist who writes political thrillers. And I've got 2 out at the moment. Have a few personal log lines ready to describe yourself.
I want to go back to what you were talking about earlier. You had a really good formula. It starts with it's a. So yeah. I don't want to leave people hanging. So walk us through your default formula for a good sentence about a book.
Okay. Well, basically it goes why, who, what, maybe how. Sometimes you have to say when and where, and sometimes you don't. So essentially the why is, why am I listening to this? But that takes about the genre. It's a romantic comedy. It's a science fiction action movie. It's a historical romance. So as you say, already you've done a couple of very, very useful things. You've told the person whether it's worth them listening anymore. You've also set up their expectation, which is very useful, because sometimes I hear people pitch things and they say 2 or 3 sentences, sometimes a whole paragraph, and I have no idea, is this a comedy or a tragedy? And it gets embarrassing. Am I supposed to be laughing here? And then I start laughing. They say, well, that actually happened to my Uncle George. And the guy's in tears. You want to set up the mood. And if you set up it's a comedy, then people are listening for the funny side of it. It makes your life a lot easier. About. And then you go straight into the protagonist. But most importantly, in most cases, few genres you don't, but in most cases, you'll be talking about the protagonist's flaw, because that's your character arc. Let's take the movie Terminator, which I often say is one of the most feminist movies ever made, and people give me a strange look. But actually, if you look at the character arc, it's about a woman who initially can't stand up for herself at all. She can't stand up to a flatmate. By the end, she's wearing army fatigues and is about to give birth to the guy who's going to save the human race. So that's a pretty big character arc, and she learns to stand up for herself. So I would start off by saying it's a science fiction action adventure movie about a woman who initially can't stand up for herself. So you start with the character's flaw, because that also gives an important answer to the why am I listening, because that's where a lot of the emotional engagement comes from. Most of us hopefully won't be pursued by a homicidal robot trying to kill us in our lives, but we could well have to learn to stand up for ourselves. So that's where we engage as human beings. So the second part of the formula, if you like, I prefer recipe because it sounds less formulaic, and recipes can make wonderful things, is the protagonists and their flaw. Then we move on to the what, and the what almost invariably, and I'm going to use a bit of jargon here, is a first act turning point. I think a lot of people know about that. There's one writer who calls books 3 disasters and an ending. And the first disaster is your inciting incident, the thing that kicks the whole thing off. Second one is the thing that really, at the end of 30 minutes in a movie, whatever it is, 60, 70, 80 pages in the book, is the turnaround that pushes you into the main story and asks the big story question. In the case of the Terminator, it would be that she discovers that she's being pursued by this homicidal, indestructible robot that's trying to kill all the people with her name. So that's the next bit of my pitch. It's a science fiction action movie about a woman who can't stand up for herself, who discovers she's being pursued by a homicidal, indestructible robot who's trying to kill all the people with her name. So you're giving either what the person is trying to do or what they're trying to escape from. That's the what that's going to power most of the movie. Now, you may want to add, depending on your pitch, a when and where if they're particularly special. Mostly otherwise it'd be taken as read, but obviously if it's historical, you'll need to be saying in the reign of Charles II or during the time of the Declaration of Independence or whatever. You might want to say it's in Alaska or Hawaii if that's particularly important to the story. You'll notice I'm not using names unless it's a true story about somebody important. I wouldn't use the name because that's just one more thing the person has to remember. And we can only remember about 7 things, I'm told, and hold them in our brain. So you don't want to clog up their brains unnecessarily. It's not important for the pitch that she's called Sarah Connor. It would be important if I was telling a story about Gandhi, for example. Then it would be important to say who it is.
Now, I would say that changes with the sequel. So it does matter for Terminator 2 that it's Sarah Connor, because now I have an emotional connection. So Sarah Connor is trapped in an insane asylum, and a Terminator's coming to kill her in the insane asylum. But I think that's a really good point. If I don't know who that character is, it's just a random name. And maybe you did a lot of research and you're like, oh, Jack Sparrow, that's a name that will resonate. It's like, yeah, but you have to earn me caring about Jack Sparrow as opposed to Jack Falcon.
Totally. So hopefully you've already got a sense of what's different from that. So you're covering most of your bases, most of your A, B, C, D, E. What really, if you can do it, if you can tie a nice little bow on it, is a little ironic twist where you jump to the end of the character arc and you say something like, but by the end of it, she's a better killer than the robot himself. So your whole pitch becomes something like, it's a science fiction action adventure movie about a woman who can't stand up for herself, who's being pursued by this homicidal, indestructible robot. By the end, she becomes a better killing machine than he is. So it gives a nice little slight ironic sense of the character arc, if you can do it. It's not always essential, but it's nice. It just ties a little bow in it. And that's particularly important when you're pitching to a professional.
So I have, while you were talking, followed your guidelines to put together a pitch.
Great.
And so I'm going to give you this pitch, and then I want you to tell me how I can make it better. Okay. So this is not a story I've written in. It's not in a genre I write in. Okay. But it's a romantic comedy about a recently divorced couple who get trapped together on a desert island where they must learn to work together in order to survive.
I like that. I can see pictures already, which is good. I can't think offhand there's obviously been people on desert islands being trapped, but I can't think offhand of something that's so totally identical it'd be too similar to anything. I think that's nice. I would want to know more about what their flaws are. What is it that they have to overcome to learn to work together? Is one of them very uptight? These are going to be cliches I'm coming up with, of course, I'm brainstorming here. And that is also going to tell me how fresh your idea, of course, because if you come up with conventional, rather stale flaws, then that will put me off. And the interesting thing is, the hardest bit of all is the inner story, this thing about the flaws. And one reason is they're going to be in some way your own flaws. I mean, writing 70,000 words is not difficult. You can just type 70,000 words. It takes physical time. But getting it so that you dig into yourself and bring out stuff that's actually meaningful for you. So I would say that is where the key part of the pitch really, that's where it comes to life, and should come to life for you too. Yeah.
And as you're talking about working in your own character flaws, one of the things that makes for a really satisfying ending is a character going through a transformation where they are a better person at the end of the film, if it's a comedy, or they are suffering the consequences of not becoming a better person if it's a tragedy. And both of those can be satisfying in their own way. I think the comedy is a little easier to sell, but tragedies often, if well executed, have really good staying power because that resonance is really powerful. And if for somebody to go through a meaningful transformation, they have to have a meaningful flaw.
Yeah.
In general, you want to have your characters have a real challenge that's relatable by the audience, right? So if you're writing a character and their big challenge is they just have too much money and managing their financial portfolio is just really stressful. That's a real challenge that some people have, but it's not relatable to very many people. Right? It's like most people are like, what does that? And so unless it's escapist, right? Like the story Richie Rich is like that. But Richie Rich really isn't about all the challenges of being rich. They're not getting into the nitty gritty of all of the boring meetings you have to sit through with your accountants when you're really rich, right? No, it's about the fun of having a butler and lots of toys and a big mansion. And so having it be relatable means understanding yourself, because you'll be able to write a truer story if you've struggled with that, right? If you're a character is struggling with pride and you struggle with pride, you can work a lot more nuance into that because you can do your own research by examining your own flaws, but also knowing your audience and knowing the flaws that they can relate to as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It has to be relatable. And at the same time, you also have to know there are 3 genres that don't focus on the flaw. And that's sometimes why you can get away with flaws that don't develop or flaws that aren't that important. And the first is adventure. James Bond, for example, we don't really care about James Bond's flaws. In fact, when they try to bring them in, they often don't work because it's about the fun. It's Indiana Jones again. I mean, yes, he's afraid of snakes, but it's not about him to deal with that. And people sometimes get hung up on this. They're trying to do, well, I can't make it work. Well, actually, what you're doing is an adventure story. It doesn't need to have the character arc. We compensate for that by giving lots of other stuff to distract the reader, lots of fun, interesting locations, fun, exciting things happening.
And lots of external challenges.
Yes.
James Bond faces more external challenges, or Indiana Jones, than in one scene than a normal person has in a lifetime, right? Like, how many people are trying to kill Indiana Jones? Like, half the people in the film are trying to kill him at any given time, right? Because there's so much external conflict. He doesn't need internal conflict. Yeah. That really distracts, right? He can't be, should I shoot the guy with the sword? I don't know. There was a guy in the sword in my past and I shot him and it turned out he was good and now I don't know. No, you don't want any of that. Just have him shoot the guy with the sword.
And that's something else I do whole workshops on, is breaking the rules, because I think it's great fun. I mean, we haven't got time here, but it's great fun to talk about. And it is an instance of how you get away with breaking a rule, which is you have a character arc, by invoking another rule, in a sense, by having more and more action. Another genre is satire. The whole point of satire is nobody gets over their flaws. They're stuck in their flaws. Something like Bonfire of the Vanities, for example. You don't expect anyone to improve as a person. That would kill the comedy of it. So you have flaws, but you don't have a character arc. And the third is a series, actually, in a funny sort of way. And I'm not talking about a series where essentially it's one story, like Hunger Games, for example, which is one story over 3 books. It's more the kind of series where you're going back in, maybe a police series or something, where each time you come back and the guy is finding he's got a new case to deal with.
Gilligan never learns to stop ruining the escape attempt.
Yeah. Yeah. So in that case, you have a mini little character arc during the book or during the TV episode or whatever. But the next book, it's reset back to 0 again and you're back where you started. Some slightly change where you'll get a character who will grow a little bit from book to book to book, but it's not a massive part of the story. It's a good bit of window dressing, if you like. The other genre to be aware of is the inverse of that, is rite of passage or coming of age, where the flaw is the whole story. And the bit in my recipe about what the person does actually is the least important part of it. And often that becomes another problem for writing the pitch, because you think, well, actually, what is the what of the story?
And I think it's important to know what your primary conflict is. So you have man versus man, right? Indiana Jones versus the Nazis. You have man versus himself, man versus society, man versus God, and man versus nature, right? These are the classic elements. And you're like, well, I've got all of those in my book. And sure enough, right? Most books have elements of all of those 5 conflicts, but you need to know what your primary conflict is, because that helps you make the story more interesting.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things I'm often doing working with people on pitches, and myself too, is getting that focus. Because you're right, there's almost always too many things in your mind, because if you're a good writer, you have lots of ideas. My first novel, it was a multi-stranded story. And I was trying to work out how to pitch this multi-stranded story. And I came up with a pitch I quite like to start with. It's not a whodunit, it's a what they did after it, which was nice. It got a sense of the humor of the thing, but it didn't really tell you anything about what the story was. Then I tried to tell everyone what all the different strands were, and that didn't really work. Then over time, partly by looking at the reviews I was getting, where people were talking about it being a thriller, so I realized it's actually a political thriller. And I focused in more and more on the main character, who's a journalist, and I focused in on what he was trying to do, which was to save his job, and he comes across a scoop, the biggest scoop he's ever found in his career. But to make it work, he has to tell a little lie, and then a bigger lie. And before he knows it, he's putting a young child's life at risk. And that has become the fundamental pitch, that it's about that, focusing in on that journalist, the lie he has to tell, and the danger, the jeopardy, which is often missing from pitches. It's called The Breaking of Liam Glass, and Liam Glass is in a coma, and he's the teenager whose life is being put at risk.
I'll say, as you're putting together your pitch, the truer you are to one genre, I feel like the easier the pitch is to craft, right? If this is just a pure adventure, it's easier to craft a pitch for it than if it's an adventure and a comedy and a romance, because now you're dealing with kind of 2 different pitch formulations at the same time. And the classic example of this is A Princess Bride, which did not do well in the theaters because the marketing team didn't know how to pitch it, right? Is it a children's story? Is it a romance? Is it an adventure? Is it a fantasy? It had so many strands, just like what you're talking about. They didn't know what to focus on. And so it wasn't until people rented it in the video store that they realized that they loved this film. But that's very rare. More often, especially in books, you just get lost in the noise, right? Princess Bride really lucked out in that it came out right at the beginning of the VHS revolution, where there wasn't that many movies in the video rental place. And not to say you shouldn't write a cross-genre book, but if it's your very first book, writing a pure single genre book may make everything easier, the writing and the pitching.
I'm going to agree and disagree. I mean, but you're probably right about being a first book. It is easier to pitch, particularly if you're going indie and you're self-publishing. If you have a genre and you know it's a genre that is a popular genre, that can vary. Having said that, I think there is a lot of argument for having a cross-genre book. It gives it an extra oomph. There is sometimes a problem if you're pitching too many genres at once. And yeah, I mean, if you've got 6 genres running, you do have a problem. Although it's quite possible you will have 6 genres, little sub-genres going, but you don't want to put that in the pitch at all. But if you think about it, romantic comedy is cross-genre by its nature. Well, I was talking about The Terminator, and it's a science fiction adventure movie. Those are 2 genres in the same movie. As long as you're clear where it sits on that Venn diagram, I think you can pitch it.
And one of the things I should point out, in every pitch example you've given, you've never mentioned more than 2 characters in a specific pitch. It may be going up to 3, but one common mistake I see authors making is they've created a dozen characters that they love, and they love them all the same. And they want to put all of the main characters and all of the side characters and that funny character who's in one scene, put them all in the pitch. Yeah. It's like, we don't need to know about all those people. Focus on the protagonist, maybe the antagonist.
And along with that, discard all the setup. Because most people spend the first 5 minutes telling me of all the stuff that goes into the beginning of the book. Well, she's doing this and she's doing that and she can't do that and she can't do that. You don't need any of that. No subplots, nothing. You notice in any of the pitches I've done. Having said that, you've just raised a very interesting question. What if your story is a multi-character story?
How do you pitch the Avengers?
Yeah, exactly. How do you pitch Ocean's 11? How do you pitch Crash? There, what you do is you find what I call the nutshell that encompasses everything. You find the one thing that they all have in common. If you remember the movie Crash, the second one, because there were two, but this was the one that was set in Los Angeles. And what they've got in common is all those storylines. And you've got actually, I worked it out, actually 12 characters with 8 running storylines crisscrossing. But they're all to do with race in Los Angeles. And that's what you would pitch. It's actually very similar to pitching a series. You pitch the overriding thematic issues. And then you might say, for example, and then you give one of the strands or one of the episodes if it's a series.
So this is a totally different pitch formulation where you're effectively pitching the theme of the story rather than a particular character. Here's what they want. Here are the stakes. Classic character-based pitch. So could you give us an example of a theme-based pitch?
Yeah. Off the top of my head, let's take the series House.
Mm-hmm.
So there you've got a guy who is fundamentally the most brilliant pathologist, and at the same time he's totally unable to relate to people. I would say, and every episode he gets a different, almost unimaginably difficult disease come in that he has to somehow work out what it is, usually with the help and hindrance of all the people around him who are trying to turn him into more of a human being, or just hate him for not being very human. And then I would say, for example, and then I go into the same basic pitch I just talked about, because you can now take one example of one story. Actually, there's an even better way of pitching House. And I just say it's Sherlock Holmes in a hospital.
Which is exactly what it is. The real-life person that inspired Sherlock Holmes in the 1800s was actually a physician. So it's going back to the core essence of what Sherlock Holmes is. And speaking of Sherlock Holmes in a hospital, Jaws in Space is your book where you walk people through this process. So if you found this episode helpful, if you're like, I have a little bit better of an idea of how to pitch, but I want more. I really want my pitch to sing, because really, this is a really good thing to optimize in your writing. I recommend that you check out Jaws in Space. You can find it on Amazon. It's not on audiobook yet, so I want to ding you for that. But Charles, give us your pitch for a book on pitching books.
I mean, Jaws in Space, it's gone down in history in the film industry that 2 screenwriters went into a producer, and that's all they said. They said Jaws in Space. And he got out his checkbook, so the story goes, and he said, write me that script. And Jaws in Space became Alien. The movie Alien. And it's become famous for the 3-word pitch. I think pitching is the great accelerator. The book is full of anecdotes, stories, but also recipes for dealing with different issues, how to take a pitch meeting. It is aimed, I will say straight off, it's aimed mostly at the movie and TV industry, fiction and non-fiction. Just about everything in it applies equally to books.
If you can learn how to pitch a $50 million film, it makes pitching a $50,000 book really easy.
Oh, I like that.
And so learning pitch techniques from the film industry will give you an edge in learning how to pitch your book, whether it's to editors, agents, or just talking to regular readers about why they would love the story that you just wrote.
And I've got a free workbook, which is based on a lot of the material in there, taking some of the juicy bits out and put them into a workbook, which you can download for free if you don't mind joining my mailing list, where I do book and film reviews and the odd article on writing and on pitching. And you can unsubscribe for free. I won't cry if you do, though I'll be happier if you stay a little bit longer. Go to jawsinspace.co.uk, jawsinspace.co.uk, and you can get that workbook for free.
And we'll have a link to Jaws in Space on Amazon, and we'll also have a link to that workbook in the show notes and blog post version of this episode. Charles Harris, thank you so much for joining us today on the Novel Marketing Podcast.
Thank you. It's been great fun.
And special thanks to our new patrons in the month of March: Elsie Price-Nader, Kent Dickerson, Daniel Harris, Belinda Kroll, Elena Mentick, Diane Gween, and Katie Zellinger. Thank you so much for helping keep the Novel Marketing Podcast on the air. I really appreciate your support. Our guest today was Charles Harris. Our producer is Lori Christine. Audio editing by William Umstadt, and the blog post is crafted by Shauna Lettler. To read the blog post version of this episode, go to authormedia.com/366. I'm Thomas Umstadt Jr. saying thank you for listening, and live long and prosper.